Thank you, Rosemary. And thank you, Calgary volunteers and everyone who worked so hard to make this possible today. Some things are constant. They never change. The sun rises in the east. We all eventually die. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. Other scenarios just seem like they're permanent, but they're really not. It feels like they'll never change, and then something happens. All the stars line up just right, and the seemingly impossible becomes a reality. Polio disappears. A man walks on the moon. The Berlin Wall falls. And today I'll show you how the impossible is becoming possible because of groups like Opportunity International. As was mentioned, I grew up in South Africa under apartheid, where 25% of the population made all the rules and owned all the land. And virtually every member of that white minority were convinced that the system was just and that it was there to stay. I received, growing up, this indoctrination from my white school friends, from my teachers, from the media, even my pastor. The situation seemed permanent. Another prevalent message that I grew up with came from the religious leaders. And though my missionary parents had zero tolerance for racism in our home, and they would bend every unjust rule they could without being deported, the message I grew up with was that God is really concerned about the spiritual and heavenly things and not about things on earth. Issues around justice and poverty just weren't a part of the agenda. The message I grew up with, though never spoken, it went something like this. Eternity is a lot longer than life, so it really doesn't matter how hungry or oppressed you are when you die, so long as you go to heaven. The situation seemed permanent. But thankfully, both those erroneous messages have been erased. They've been silenced. Apartheid has collapsed, and there's this growing revolution of people committed to ending extreme poverty during our lifetime. I know that sounds like a big, hairy, audacious goal, and it is. Extreme poverty seems so permanent. But today's poverty can be yesterday's Berlin Wall. More than 2,000 years ago, this ancient Jewish prophet outlined what is expected of humanity. Everything, he says, everything begins with doing justice. But how do we do justice today when the playing field is so uneven? When the wealth of the 3 richest individuals is greater than the assets of the poorest 48 countries combined? When almost half of humanity is suffering to survive on $2 a day? And when you look at this disparity in light of Micah's calling to do justice, it makes me feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. I know what to do, but where do I begin? Before we go to bed tonight, some 25,000 people will die from hunger and related illness. And tomorrow, another 25,000 people will die from hunger. And the next day, and the next. But the real tragedy is that for 90% of those people, there is no shortage of food. They simply don't have the money to buy the food that is readily available. So how do we do justice? How do we follow Micah's teaching? How do we create a global system that would be fair for everybody? Growing up and living almost 20 years in South Africa under the all-white regime, I realize that every system will be flawed if those who are affected by it are not represented when the rules are made. To illustrate how we could come up with an equitable system, an economics professor designed this exercise for his students. So imagine flipping a coin, and while it is still in the air and spinning, and you not knowing how it's going to land, you make up the rules for the world. Because if it comes down and lands heads, you're here in North America with all our privileges, freedoms, and opportunities. But if it lands tails, you work on a sugar plantation in Haiti and survive on $1 a day for the rest of your life. And if we don't know how that coin will land, we will make far more equitable rules. But the rules are never made in this vacuum of knowledge. Knowing how the dice lands, the wealthy make up the rules in our own favor. And the worst example of this today, perhaps, is President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who, after he took over power, he then changed all the rules and has utterly demolished this nation that was the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa. And world over, the poor are not represented and seldom considered, leaving the poorest members of our global village on this treadmill of generational poverty from which they will never get off. And as a result, we live in a world today where 20% of humanity, 1.3 billion people, are surviving on $1 a day. And that is the unjust layer of poverty that together we can undo. To illustrate how that bottom billion survive, let me introduce you to Lola. I will never forget visiting Lola's little hovel in the Philippines. And the shelter that this widow shares with 5 other squatters is made up of wood and tin and gunny sack and anything else that they could scavenge. I couldn't even stand up in it. And outside the door, immediately out there, is this open trench with raw sewage. And squatting on the side of this trench, she would do her laundry and wash her dishes. And into it she would pour her bath water. And after relieving herself, she would empty this pot into this trench that's shared by hundreds of other families in her village. At 72, Lola should be enjoying a life of retirement after working her entire life so hard. But when there are no safety nets for the poor or the elderly, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so everyone in this community, including her, had this little enterprise. They had their own enterprise that was working out of their homes. And Lola's was making little lanterns like this out of jars, food jars. They're essential in her community because electricity is pretty inconsistent at best. Lola spends the first part of every day scavenging other people's garbage to gather enough jars for the day's production of lamps. Then for several hours, she squats in front of her house and cleans them, flushing any remaining food into the shallow trench where it merges with the other garbage, human feces, and the occasional toy accidentally abandoned by a child playing upstream. Finally, after scrubbing the jars and scraping off the labels, she's ready to begin making the lanterns. She punches a hole in the top and she feeds in this little rope that serves as a wick. And then from a sheet of metal, she cuts these straps and makes this handle that she wraps around so that she can carry it safely. And Lola hopes by the end of the day that she will make and sell enough of these jars so that she can buy that meal so that she doesn't have to go to bed hungry. You see, for the bottom billion, the primary objective every day is survival. Let me introduce you to another one of these survivors, a woman I met in Zimbabwe. Her name is Teresa. Teresa was forced to drop out of grade school because her mother needed for her to help her make and sell these brooms out of sticks and grass. You see, when you're choosing between education and survival, it really is not a choice. And Teresa could not go to school. Like many girls, when Teresa became a teenager, she became a mother. And later, she left her farm village and went into the capital, followed her husband, who was going to find work. Shortly after they arrived in Harare, her husband deserted her and their 4 children and left her even more impoverished. And determined to keep her children in school, Teresa became a domestic maid for 3 different families, and she was working 12 to 14 hours every day before she would come home and provide services for her own children. I took each one of my 3 children when they were teenagers, one at a time, with me on trips to meet people like this, because I wanted my kids to understand how blessed they were. I wanted them to see how the other half lived. And I wanted them to choose for themselves to do something about global poverty. Because talking about justice and thinking about justice isn't enough. If we're going to change the world for Lola and for Teresa, we all have to do justice. This call for action is at the center of the story that we all know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this tale, the master storyteller contrasts 3 responses to a poor victim. The first is the offender himself, who beats up and robs this man and leaves him for dead on the side of the road. And we have many today who would prey on the poor and the vulnerable. And that offender's view, both then and today, is this: what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine if I can get it. The storyteller then introduces us to a group of religious leaders who walk by this body on the side of the road. They see the situation, but they don't want to get involved. After all, they didn't create this mess. They're not responsible for it, and it might cost them something, and so they do not get engaged. And their response would go something like this: what's yours is yours, and what's mine is mine if I can keep it. And then we're introduced to the hero of the story, the Good Samaritan, who walks by, sees this person in this condition, picks him up, takes him to a local inn, and agrees to cover all the costs to bring him back to health. And that's the moral of the story, that we are to hold loosely to what we own and respond generously to those in need. And the Good Samaritan's response would be this: what's yours is yours, and what's mine is yours if you need it. The clear lesson is that to do justice requires action. The difficulty, however, is what is the right thing to do? Responding to the poor, regrettably, we often respond with relief rather than development. It's so much easier to give the poor something than to empower them to meet their own needs. It's a myth that the poor need or want our handouts. Yes, when there is a disaster, relief is necessary, like the earthquake in Haiti or like the droughts in Somalia. But when an able and willing person who is healthy and wants to work, but they cannot because there are no jobs and there is no access to credit, then the solution is not to hand them one more fish. When parents are so poor that they can't feed their own children, yes, they will take our handouts, but every time they do, they exchange it for a piece of their own dignity. Put yourself in the shoes of a mother who is so malnourished that she cannot produce enough milk to feed her own crying infant. And what it does to your self-esteem to take the handouts of other people because you cannot feed your own offspring. So how can we be a good Samaritan to that woman and offer her an empowering hand up rather than a handout. And it was in response to that very question that 40 years ago, Opportunity International was launched. Before the word microfinance even appeared in the dictionaries, Opportunity International was making small loans to very poor people so that they could feed their families and educate their children. And one of our loans went to Lola, that elderly woman I mentioned earlier. Though her loan was only $50, you would have thought that she hit the jackpot. She was so grateful for this loan and for what it did for her in her life and how it changed her whole situation. With her new loan, Lola arranged with a recycling company to regularly deliver to her doorsteps bundles of spotless jars. She now begins each day with the grunt work behind her. She has more time to dedicate to the activity that has added value to her life and given her satisfaction, making and selling lamps. She doesn't have to work so hard, and now she has hope. For the first time in her life, Lola has started saving. And I keep this on my credenza at home as a reminder of this woman's gratitude and of how hard she's willing to work. And the other lady that I mentioned, Teresa, she eventually remarried. And now with her 5th child, this was the impetus that she needed to find an enterprise where she could work out of her home with her children. And that's when she heard about Opportunity International. And she took out a small loan, and she started a little store. She was selling vegetables out of the front of her house. And she called it a supermarket, but trust me, it wasn't. I saw it. But shortly, she made enough money off this, and she started another supermarket on the other side of town, and she hired somebody to run that. And then a year or so later, she took out a second loan, and this time she bought firewood. She hired somebody to bring a truckload of logs, and they dumped it down in front of her house. And then she hired somebody to cut them up to these little pieces and sell them, because everybody in her community was dependent upon a wood-burning stove to do their daily cooking and boil their drinking water. She soon paid off the firewood loan, and she took out a third loan, this time for a commercial-grade hairdryer. And she turned one of the little rooms in her tiny little house into a beauty salon, and she hired one of the ladies in her community to come in and cut hair. And with the profits of this business, she bought a second chair and hired somebody else, and then a third. I can still picture the 3 women, dressed in their matching pink and white uniforms, all busily working on different customers' hair, and Teresa looking on with the pride of a coach after her team had just pulled off a major upset. And at night, she reclaimed the hair salon as sleeping quarters for her family. Her 4th loan, she then added a little room to the side of her house. And she bought a used foosball table and some old outdated arcade games, and she turned this into a game room for the children after school. And after she paid off that investment, this entrepreneur with a 3rd grade education, she borrowed money, still less than $1,000, and she bought a freezer. And at the end of every day, she would fill these little baggies with different flavored fruit juice, and over a candle, she would seal it closed, and she'd put them in the freezer. And the next day, she would sell popsicles for a few pennies to these children on their way home from school. Now in her 80s, Teresa's workday begins at 4 in the morning with the bookkeeping for her 4 businesses. At 7, she starts her rounds, inspecting the different operations. She still runs the firewood stand and the supermarkets. She closed the beauty salon when her husband, who has since died, became bedridden. Recently, she added another business. She is the distributor for Coca-Cola in her area. She sells soda by the cases to others who then sell bottles from their homes or their supermarkets. And the last I heard, she was applying for a loan to buy a truck, one that would double as a delivery vehicle for the wholesale soda business as well as function as a hearse. She sold the video games to make room for a funeral business where she sells caskets. With AIDS devastating her nation and life expectancy at that time down in the 30s, the demand for her latest enterprise was on the rise. I tell you these stories to dispel some of the hurtful myths that we sometimes carry about poor people. You see, these remarkable people are poor simply because of where they were born. They're poor because of latitude and longitude, not because of laziness or lack of any ability. Secondly, the poor are assets. They're not liabilities siphoning off what the industrialized nations are producing. But they are rich. Though they're monetarily poor, they're affluent in areas where I am so often bankrupt. And they have so much to teach us and so much to bring to the table. And in my book on poverty, the working poor show us how to live in community with others while also being self-reliant. From them, we learn about faith and the value of family. They teach us to be grateful, resourceful, and persistent. So we don't have to reach every poor person in order to end poverty, extreme poverty. We simply provide this highly leveraged, catalytic role of microfinance. The overarching theme of Unpoverty is that during our lifetime, we can end extreme poverty. Yes, there will always be people who are poorer than me. But this layer at the bottom billion, doesn't have to be that way. And we can join a movement where that grinding reality of survival every day can be undone. Though I've coined the word unpoverty, I'm not starting a revolution. Going before us, Jeffrey Sachs wrote The End of Poverty, and Dr. Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Bono and the One Campaign, and a host of others. There is this great momentum, and you don't want to miss the opportunity to be a part of this revolution, to bring about justice, and to end extreme poverty. This situation is not permanent. An old African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And we've come a long way in eradicating poverty, and we have a ways to go. But if enough of us get together and get behind this mission, the objective can be accomplished. Today, we inhabit a world with virtually no polio and a crumbled Berlin Wall. Now imagine a world with no extreme poverty, where our grandchildren will have to learn about it by going to the poverty museums, and where you and I choose to live more simply so that others can simply live, and where everybody can live with hope and dignity. Thank you for all that you've already done here in Calgary, and thank you for what you will do to help to create a world